Hey, Edie.
Hey, Deb, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. The reason I wanted to do this recording is because there are some Now What book clubs that are happening in various long-term care homes. And there's been some questions that have come in from participants. And
Oh,
so I want to be able to ask you these questions and unpack a couple of concepts. So it sounds like the concept that you write about in my Now What book about disenfranchised grief. There's some questions about what is that, to break that down a little bit more, and how does it show up?
it's such a great question because too often we think, oh, grief, it means you've lost a loved one. And that's true. That is a response to the loss of a loved one. But what disenfranchised grief is about, and actually the person who created it is a guy by the name of Ken Doka. And what it is a grief that society doesn't validate, like the loss of a pet or the loss of the caretaker role or the grief that you feel putting a loved one into a long-term care home.
Okay, so in that situation where someone is needed to make the decision to put their parent or their spouse in long-term care, is it that are they feeling disenfranchised because other people can't recognize the grief, or are they also having a hard time wrapping their head around the grief that they're experiencing? Because it,
Both.
okay.
Yeah, it's a yes and truly what we need to be doing is figuring out a way to introduce the idea that there is going to be grief and it's okay. And it's not because you've lost someone. It may be because you've lost that role, but we don't identify it as such. So instead, what ends up happening is someone will say, a professional might assess that person as having depression or anxiety or feeling despair or numb, and all of that's true, but the accurate label is grief.
Mhm.
So it's unrecognized by the perhaps frontline staff, and it's also goes unrecognized by the family and the resident as well.
Mhm. Well, and that leads to another one of the questions that came up in the book club around spouse grief. And the comment that was shared with me is that, no one's home, you're having single meals, you're adjusting to life alone. And when I read that, I thought I could really relate to that personally when my husband Ty went into long-term care. But the other thing is that I had two young kids that I had to take care of. So it wasn't single by myself in that regard, but you're still feeling single in that you don't have that partner there with you.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious what your thoughts or any words or suggestions that you would have for the individuals who've asked this question in the book club about how do they grapple with that spouse grief?
So there's different levels of spousal grief, especially when we're talking about long-term care. There's the spousal grief that happens when there's a diagnosis of memory loss, of dementia. And that spousal loss can happen then when your spouse doesn't recognize you once in a while or all of the time, when they can't remember things that you used to share or food that you love to cook together. That's a loss and a grief. And then there's the loss that you just spoke about. You're home, you're alone, and that person that you shared your life with, that partner, is no longer sitting across the table with you. You don't have somebody to kind of turn around to and say, hey, I had a good day today. And we need to find people we can do that with, and also recognize the loss that we have. And one of the things that I tell people, and I do it myself after having lost my partner and at 27, I was young as well. And I didn't have any children at that point, is to think about what you might want to say to your spouse, even if they're not around, even if they've passed away. And keep a journal of, these are the things I would say, these are the things that are going on within me, because what we know is that when we take what's inside and we put it on paper, or we even speak it out loud, it actually gives our brains, and that amygdala part of our brain that carries emotions, it gives ourselves a release.
Mm. I really like that. And it reminds me of, I was the cook in our family, so I wasn't even really allowed in the kitchen. And so when he lived in long-term care, I had to figure some stuff out. And the first time that I was able to light the barbecue and barbecue some chicken and whatever else, I do remember coming in and sitting with the kids, and I said, your dad would be pretty proud that I was able to pull this off. And it actually tastes pretty good too. And of course they would say, well, not as good as dad would have done it, right?
That's right.
Fair
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah,
But it was like we included him in that conversation, and
that's
in a
right.
way that it wasn't about, oh, it's too bad that your dad's missing this meal. It's, he would be so proud and would really enjoy that we're able to enjoy this. So
So what I love about that is you also turned a situation that was really hard on you and really hard on the kids. And it's hard on kids no matter what the age, if they're in their teens or they're younger than that, or they're older, they're still kids to the parents that are going through this. And it's really important to be able to find something encouraging about maybe a changed behavior or a changed role, just like what you just described. So yeah, you became the cook, but then the kids reminded you, and rightly so, yeah, well, it wasn't as good as dad's. And it was their way of remembering their dad and his talents in the kitchen. And it was a way for all of you to hold your grief.
and that actually leads to the third question that came in. So in one of the Now What book clubs, another question that came in was about people whose parents are in long-term care and the grief that they're walking with their adult children. Kids in their 20s who have either been a caregiver to their grandparent who's no longer at home, or the kids are worried that they'll get their grandparents' illness.
Mm.
I thought, what an interesting, because there have been situations where my kids, did ask about Ty's diagnosis and if it was genetic. And I think it's a really fair worry as we see so many articles and warnings about Alzheimer's and dementia and aging. So I'm curious what your thoughts, or what you would want to share with the book club members about that question.
There's one thing for sure, as we watch our loved ones age and go into long-term care, or we are the caretakers and then that role is taken away because they're the kind of care that's needed is not the kind of care that we can give. And what I think is important here is that we can watch the aging process, and we do have some degree of denial that it's going to happen to us. And it's a healthy denial, because otherwise, I think thinking about, oh my God, I'm going to age and I'm going to age out, and it can really be crazy making, can really make us feel so much at a loss. And so instead, to turn it around and think, I have the privilege of watching my grandparent go through this part of their lives, and maybe there are some beautiful kernels of shared stories or of wisdom that gets passed down to the children, and those children, as they emerge into their own adulthood, get to use those little bits of wisdom and take those tiny moments that they've shared and move with them. I know that my grandmother, she used to call me Edie Sue, and she used to say, oh, Edie Sue, you're going to be a writer. And there was no way that I ever thought that I would be a writer. And now that I've been writing more, like that wisdom that I poo-pooed stays with me. And so she's alive in me. She lived to a ripe old age of 96, and she taught me so much. But instead of being afraid, oh, that's what's going to happen to me, I'm able to say she can walk with me while I write. And
Mhm.
that's, again, it's finding ways to change how you hold the grief or the changed relationship or the fear, because there is fear for many people about aging, about getting what our loved one got. And you might not, but you need to be in the moment. You need to be in the here and now. And it doesn't mean that you won't think about it, but remember that you've got now, and now is so important.
It makes me think about the chapter about intention and recipe for empathy, where I talk about be intentional with your intentions. And I think a really practical takeaway from what you just said can be when the adult children, when you're visiting your loved one in long-term care, to be able to say, what is my intention with this visit? Or what one thing do I want to remember fondly, a year, 2 years, whatever time frame into the future. When I look back on this day, what do I want to create? What do I want to make happen? Or what do I want to enjoy in that moment that can become one of those reflective memories?
That's
Right?
exactly
Because
right.
what we're doing is we're taking the focus off of ourselves and putting it onto them, or we're focusing our energy and being present with them versus the fear of, oh gosh, it would be awful if I ever ended up like that.
That's right. Yeah. It is. It's easy to slide into that position. And the invitation is there, though, to really be with your loved one in that moment, because who knows what kind of magic or information you might glean because you've actually been present and haven't been so worried about what hasn't yet happened.
Brilliant. Love it.
Love it.
So I'm going to put out the invitation to our book clubs if they have any other questions related to your chapter about grief, to send them in, and we'll have another conversation like this. And also want to mention for people watching this that Edy has her book, It's Grief. And if you go to Edy at if you go to edynathan.com website, you could also email Edy at edynathan.com, I guess, or
Absolutely.
you can order on Amazon. It's a great book. I remember when I first met you and you gifted me a copy, and I read probably 3/4 of it on my way back from on my flight back from New York after meeting you. And it was at the right time, and it was the right message, and hence the reason why we're working together.
That's right. Absolutely. And because we're starting this conversation, I would also love to offer anybody in the book club, if anything that Deb and I have talked about today reminds you of something that you've been going through, let us know, because we can also, if with permission, bring up your story and have a conversation about it. Because if you're going through it, there's a really good chance someone else is too.
Great idea. Love it. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.